In 1963, Turkey was the first country to sign an association agreement with the European Union, an agreement that foresaw eventual membership for Turkey in the European Union. The next decisive step came in 2005, when, on the basis of a recommendation from the European Commission, my institution, accession talks for eventual membership by Turkey in the European Union began. The crucial consideration in deciding whether to start negotiations with a candidate country is the extent to which it fulfills the basic criteria, political criteria for membership in the European Union: democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, rights of persons belonging to minorities, and so on. And in that year, the Commission considered that Turkey sufficiently fulfilled these criteria to start accession talks. So the slowdown of the political reforms has been one of the reasons why the negotiations have been going more slowly, because there's a general principle that the pace of accession negotiations reflects the pace of reforms in the candidate country concerned. And the EU made clear when the accession negotiations started that Turkey needed to extend the association agreement with all its implications to all member states of the European Union, including the Republic of Cyprus. And Turkey needed to make progress also towards normalization of relations with Cyprus. So far, this commitment has not been honored by Turkey, and there are many discussions around this issue. And it doesn't seem for the time being as though the government is giving particular priority to the reforms needed to make progress in these areas. As a result, the second half of 2010 was the first EU presidency period, 6-month rotating presidency period since 2006, when we failed to open a negotiating chapter. Not too serious in itself, we could catch up perhaps this year, but worrying, as it may point to a trend.
Turkey is a great country, and we hope that it has a bright future, especially after the next election. But I have to talk about the regime that exists now. Now, we should remember what the Turkish model meant 2 years ago, for many years before that. Turkish model meant a secular, democratic state which was very pro-Western, a loyal ally of NATO, a reliable partner, an opponent of radical regimes. Now, the Turkish model has become, well, they're Islamist, but they're not too Islamist. They're pro-Iran and pro-Syria and pro-Hezbollah and pro-Hamas, but not too, and they totally disregard Western and US foreign policy interests, but not 100%. Domestically, the Turkish model is a road toward Islamization. How fast or how slow the truck drives along that road is open to question, but the driver knows where he's heading. The fact is that people generally ignore all the steps that the regime is taking to fundamentally transform, if you've heard that phrase before, Turkey into something very different than it's been since the republic was established. So Turkey has moved toward an alliance with Syria. That's pretty serious. Now, the Turkish government likes Lebanon. It loves the Lebanese people. Which Lebanese people? Not the March 14th coalition. It likes Hezbollah, and it sees Hezbollah as its ally in Lebanon. And of course, the Turkish government loves the Palestinians. Which Palestinians? Not the Palestinian Authority, Hamas. And what do these four groups have in common? They're all radical Islamist groups that are anti-Western, that are dedicated to the removal of Israel from the map. The Turkish government has gone over to the other side. I just want to say a word on Israel very briefly. The problem between Turkey and Israel is not based on the Gaza flotilla, and it's not based on the operation in Gaza. I don't care what anybody tells you. It's based on the ideology and direction of the Turkish government. There's nothing that Israel can do that's going to change that. But if there's another government in Turkey, and Turkey is a country, I believe, where free elections still prevail, then I think there'll be another policy. Now that sounds like a good Turkish model to me. You have elections where the other side can actually win.
my personal feeling about Turkey's current foreign policy, and I'm quite willing to agree with you that some of its aspects currently are extremely problematic, and I can understand why Israel is upset. But I do think that in the long run, this policy of, as it were, engaging with Russia, Iran, Syria, and others is going to prove disappointing and frustrating for Turkey in many ways. I think that Turkey, in many ways, and I hope the Turkish diplomats here forgive me for saying this, there are a number of them in the room, I think that Turkey's slightly overrates its weight. It's batting slightly above its weight in these relationships. And I think that in the long run, it is extremely likely that it will find that it has more steady allies in the US and in Europe. Perhaps all of us in the West have failed to see, take on board, understand, empathize with is the enormous tensions arising out of both the increasing ossification of Kemalism in Turkey and secular nationalism. Also, I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind, and have, if I dare say so, some patience with, is the enormous social and political and cultural tension created in Turkey by what has been a very, at times, a galloping reform and modernization process. And again, I think a little bit of patience is in order here while we criticize what needs to be criticized.
Mr. Weinstein, when he introduced the panel, talked about Ahmadinejad in Istanbul 2005. I could remind the audience and him that 2005 was also the year when Tayyip Erdogan came to Israel. I think he visited Yad Vashem, and he shook hands with Ariel Sharon, who, for an ideological person, must not have been a very easy thing to do. It is true that Sudan's al-Bashir has come to Turkey twice, and the third time was aborted because we just raised hell. But you also seem to forget that Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, spoke in his own language in the Turkish National Assembly. I think it was in 2007. And that it was under Erdogan that business relations between Israel and Turkey have truly flourished. I would strongly object to a line of thinking that actually situates Turkish foreign policy today to the day when the AKP was elected. I think to look at these pictures and miss the general strategic framework and the continuities and structural influences in that determine Turkish foreign policy is first misleading. At times it can be dishonest. And thirdly, if you're trying to understand Turkey, because it is a country that can cause concern, obviously, then you are missing the point. On Iran, it is true that Turkey appeared to be covering for Ahmadinejad in ways that I don't particularly like seeing. On the other hand, it would be only half the picture, since Turkey does continue to balance Iran in Lebanon. It failed with the Hezbollah-backed government now. It does so in Iraq, and in ways that obviously you may not see that way. Even with Hamas, it is trying to reduce the influence of Iran.
There are indeed grave reasons for concern about the evolution of Turkish domestic policy and Turkish foreign policy. Domestically, we've seen since 2002 a very sophisticated utilization of all the tools of power, from tax authorities to propaganda, to abuse of the rule of law, to get rid of the opposition. Where was Prime Minister Erdogan when his friend Ahmadinejad was shooting peaceful demonstrators in Tehran? We have not heard one denunciation from Ankara of the bloodbath in Tehran. So all this raises a question. Is Turkey transforming itself from a NATO ally to enabler of terrorism? All these are worrisome signals, and we better work with those enlightened and pro-Western forces in Turkey. We better work with our European allies, and yes, with Israel, in order to stop and hopefully reverse this process.
The assumption here is that Turkey is a country that is on the move towards Europe in many ways still, and we want to encourage this. And the question for us is, how do we do this? Because if we paint this as something that is existential and essentialist in its nature, then I think that we are essentially already excluding the Turks and assuming that positive change is no longer possible. I think that would be dangerous for all of us.